Hey everybody, and welcome to this, my second of two videos on the Pentax S or H2. And if you missed the first one, Asahiflex is just what this is called, but it is the exact same camera as the Honeywell Highland, or the Pentax S or H2. Now, as we do in these videos, the first thing is to change the battery. However, this camera has no battery, and so you don't need to change the battery. The drawback to that is there's no light meter. The positive to that is you never have to worry about a battery corroding. And it also means that this camera is entirely mechanical, and that personally I prefer a mechanical camera, because if you have an electronic camera and the batteries die, you are out of luck. Not needing batteries, you can keep shooting as long as you have film. So the next thing we're going to do is talk about how to mount and unmount lenses. This has an M42 lens mount, so it can accept almost any M42 lens. There are some Mamiya lenses that can't. But if you have a Helios like this one, or a Takumar like this would have come with, or even many third-party M42 lenses, you're going to be just fine. So to remove it, you just unscrew it counter or anti-clockwise until it comes off of the camera. And then to mount your new lens, you just line it up and start turning it until the threads catch the raceways, and turn it clockwise until it stops, and now you've replaced and mounted your new lens. Next thing we're going to do is load film, and I'm going to show you how this camera uses film. So to load the film, we're going to open up the film back, which on this camera is a little bit tweaked. It doesn't like opening unless I open it a very specific way. So to load film, you pop the film rewind knob, forks, and post up. You can see here there's some forks. Those forks engage the film cassette spool in the center there, and we'll see why that's important in just a minute. The biggest reason it's important is it allows you to rewind the film. So just push the film knob back in, pull out your leader. We're going to insert it into the take-up spool here. We're going to advance a frame. Make sure that the film is lined up with the sprocket. Advance another. Now we know that everything's going well. And at this point, or after you close the film back, take any of the slack out of the film cassette. Just rewind this until you feel tension. You don't want to crank it. Close the film back. And now we're going to reset the frame counter. You turn it the direction of the arrow. And I forget if this one counts up or down. I'm going to assume that it counts up. We're going to set this for 3 frames before 0. You could also do this after you advance the film like I'm about to do, and just set it to 1 at that point. 6 one way, half dozen the other. Yeah, good, it counts up. So next we're going to advance it 3 frames. And we are now at 0. So if you leave it at 0, it says I've taken 0 photos, or if you advance it 1, I'm on frame number 1. Again, personal preference, how you want to have it set, just all about communicating with your future self. So the next thing we're going to do is set the film memo dial. Let's pretend that we loaded 50 ISO black and white film in here. This isn't going to control at all how the camera functions. It's just to remind us what exposure settings we need to calculate. So if you look at the film knob here, watch as I advance the film, it spins. If it spins, you know that the film is being advanced properly through the camera. And the reason that this spins is the film's being taken up over here on the film take-up spool. It's being pulled out of the cassette, and the cassette spool locks into the forks in this post, and it creates a mechanical linkage across the back of the camera with the film. That's why this spins as the film's being taken up, and you can use it to rewind the film. So you'll go through your day and you'll take your photos, and eventually you will get to the end of the roll, and I'll show you what's going to happen with the end of the roll in a minute. But before that, I'm going to show you what's happening inside of your camera. Now, just so you know, film is one and done if you are new to it. So film can record light exactly one time, either in a controlled manner through a proper shutter speed and aperture that allows you to record an image, or in an uncontrolled manner where it absorbs every single photon that comes its way, like this. So if you were to open your film, real film that you were using, while it was still in the camera like this, everything that's outside of the cassette would be erased and ruined. You would get no images from it. Likewise, if you exposed your film before loading it, it would be unable to record an image. Once film is exposed to the light like this, it's completely shot. So I want you to see what's going on with this film here. When you take a picture, the film take-up spool pulls the film, the sprocket helps guide it. The film guide rails on the outside here keep it from moving up and down, and then you can see the inner guide rails through these sprocket holes and how they mesh with the film pressure plate. And then right here you can see where it's being pulled out of the cassette. Now, again, remembering that you have to do all of this with the film back closed until you've completely rewound the film. After you've run out of film, you can then rewind it. And to rewind it, you simply hold down the film or depress the film rewind button here, and you don't have to hold it on this model camera. And then just rewind. You're about to hear a sound here, and that's audible with the film back closed. That sound lets you know you're almost done rewinding the film, and what you want to do is just rewind it a few more times. I need to reuse this film, so I'm going to leave a leader so that I can use it in other videos, but you would not want to leave a leader if you're done with it. And the reason is that if you don't have a leader, then it is easier to make sure that you don't accidentally use that roll of film again. Okay, so you finished your roll of film, you take it out. Now you can either grab your next roll of film and put it in and keep shooting, or if you are done for the day, close up your film back, trigger your shutter, and you are good to go to set this aside for the evening. Next thing we're going to talk about is using a flash on this camera. And we're going to talk a little bit about the mechanics and a little bit about technique. So one thing you'll notice is that there is no hot shoe on this camera. Early Pentax S and H cameras did not have hot shoes, so they had these little adapters that would clip onto them. The reason they didn't have hot shoes is because they could have light meters that were connected to the top of them. Now this adapter, you'll notice, does not have any contacts. It's what's called a cold shoe, meaning that if you just put a flash in here, just a modern flash, the camera's not going to be able to trigger it. You have to connect the flash through the ports in the front. Any flash you can buy today will work, just with limited usability. This type of camera requires a fully manual flash, one where you can set the settings and calculate all of the settings yourself. Any flash you use will need a flash cable, a PC cable it's called, to connect to the X-Sync port right there. Bulbs have not been made in any real quantity for a long time, so realistically you're not likely to use them. The X-Sync, you could just pick up a third-party flash online anywhere today. It will work. You can find an old Vivitar flash from the 70s or 80s, and if it works, it will also work. So the flash sync speed on this camera is 1/50th, and that's marked by this X. And what that tells us is you can use the flash at that speed and anything slower. Anything faster, 60th to 1/500th, you cannot use an X flash. These speeds you may have been able to use FP or M bulbs. However, like I said, those fundamentally are not made anymore. So for your X flash use, what you'll want to do is set the shutter dial to either X, or if you have a specific reason, to one of the slower shutter speeds. The reason for that is that, let's imagine for a second that what you're looking at in the video is going to be a photo on film. And the film right now is behind your shutter curtains. When you trigger the shutter, the first curtain opens, and when it finishes its travel, the flash triggers, and then the second curtain closes. Shutter speed's not governed by how quickly the curtains move, but by the gap between them. The curtains will always move at the same speed. So if you have the camera set at your X-Sync, the curtain will open, your flash will fire, and then it will fire at the moment when all of the film is exposed to light for about 1/50th of a second. and then the second curtain will close, and then when you advance the film, they reset. If you shoot this at 1/250th, the first curtain will open, and then the second curtain will follow behind, leaving just a slit between the two. At this point, the flash will fire, and everything here will be illuminated, but everything here would be blank because it was blocked by the curtain. So if you use an X flash at a shutter speed faster than your X sync speed, you will only get a partial frame. So that's the mechanics of it. If you do a 2-second or a half-second exposure, the first curtain opens, the flash triggers, and then a half-second later, the second curtain closes. So anything slower, you can also use a flash, an X flash with. All right, so that's the mechanics of it, some basic tips for flash use. Now you're going to have to use your PC socket. So if you buy a flash to mount to the cold shoe, if you have one of those, it has to connect to the PC socket. The worst possible place for a flash, however, is right on top of your camera, unless you have one that's articulating and you bounce it off of the ceiling. If you're going to use a flash with this camera because you have to cable connect it anyway, your best bet is not to even bother having the little cold shoe adapter, and instead get a flash bar like this that mounts a flash off to the side of your camera. And this allows you to bounce it off a wall if you have one with an articulating head, bounce it up and off the ceiling, things like that. It gives you more creative control over your flash, and since your flash has to connect by cable anyway, this is an easy way to do it. So basically, if you have your flash here, the light exits your flash, reaches your subject, comes back down to your lens, and your subject will look flat and waxy, and it's not flattering. But if you have your flash pointing up, especially off to the side, the light's going to exit it, bounce off of the ceiling down to your subject and back to your lens. And if you think about the way that we see the world, the sun is above us. Lights in our buildings are above us. Whenever we see something, it is lit from above. That's just how our brains are used to seeing things. So if something is not lit from above, if it's from the side or below or directly on, it seems unnatural to us. So you want to have your flash mimic real life, and the best way to do that is to have your light coming from the flash to a space above your subject and then back down. So that's a really basic set of how to use your flash and some tips on it. The next thing let's go through is how to take a picture with this camera. You're going to need an external light meter with this camera, or you're going to need to use the Sunny 16 rule. The Sunny 16 rule is that if you are outside in full sun with the sun to your back, your shutter speed is the number nearest your film speed. So if we have 50 ISO film in here, we could use the flash sync speed and achieve the Sunny 16 rule. There are variations. If you're in the shade, f8. If you're indoors, f2 or f2.8 or f4, depending on the amount of indoor lighting. If you're like in a surgery suite, it's f4. If you're in your living room, it's probably f2. So at any rate, those are some guides you can use. And so what you'll do is you'll calculate, let's say with the Sunny 16 rule, you'll figure out your film speed, your shutter speed, and then we'll set this to f16. Oops, that's f2. Go down here to f16, there we are. Focus our lens, that looks pretty good. And now we take our picture and we have taken our first frame. Okay, so we're indoors. We're still using 50 ISO film for some nonsensical reason. We're going to drop this to f2, and we're actually going to give ourselves a little bit more time here at 1/30th of a second. We're going to set this on a table if we don't have a tripod to make it more steady. And then we'll take our picture, again, focusing as we need to. Okay, great. What about double exposures? Double exposures on this camera use the standard old-timey double exposure method. First, I'm going to explain the science, and then I'll show you the mechanics. So let's say we're using a different film. We're using 200 ISO film, and we're in a setting where 1/125th of a second and f5.6 are the accurate shutter speed. Okay, that's one frame advance. That's a single properly exposed frame. if we want a double exposure, we don't want to do that twice. If you have your film here, right, and you expose it with one proper exposure, and then you do that again on the same piece of film, you've given it twice as much light as it should have. And the drawback to that is that you will have what are called dense, thick, or dark negatives. They're three words that mean the exact same thing. And basically, it's that your negatives look dark and they've had too much light. If you print them in a lab, you'll have reduced contrast and longer print times. If you digitize them, you'll have increased scanner noise and reduced contrast. So a good double exposure practice is a good idea. If you are going to put 2 frames onto your film, you need to cut the amount of light in half to achieve 1 proper frame. So there's a couple different ways to do that, with the shutter or with the aperture. Now, if you're going to do it with the shutter, take a guess at which shutter speed we need. These are fractions. You have to go to 1/250th. 1/250th of a second is half as much time, half as much light as 1/125th. If you're going to do it with the aperture, you have to go to f8. f8 is half as much light as f5.6. Each time you go up a stop, go faster a stop, you cut the amount of light in half. Each time you go down a stop, go slower a stop, you double the amount of light. So that's the process, the mechanics behind it. So we're going to go 1/250th of a second twice to get our double exposure. Okay, so here's how we do it mechanically. We're going to take our first frame. There we go. And next we're going to put our finger on the film rewind button. We're going to hold the film rewind knob here, and we're going to advance the film. Okay. Next we're going to take our second frame. One thing about old cameras like this, as a general rule, I do not like taking double exposures with them because it is not the easiest thing on the camera. And when you have an old camera like this, it's really a lot better just to baby them and not do fancy stuff. At any rate, then we're going to advance our film. We're not done with our double exposure yet. And the reason is that when you advance the film after a double exposure, it takes a second for the gearing to start up, and so the film doesn't advance immediately, and it only advances part way. So if you take your next frame, it's going to partially overlap your double exposure. So what you need to do is set your aperture to f16, your shutter speed to 1/500th, put your lens cap on your lens, and then take a dead frame and advance it. That will ensure that your double exposure is past the next frame so that you don't end up ruining both your double exposure and your next image. So the last thing we're going to talk about is how to use bulb and time. And I'm going to show you inside the camera how they work differently. So this is a 1-second exposure. You can see that what happens is the first curtain opens, the camera counts down the time, and this is the same process whether it's 1 second or 1/500th. The camera counts down the time, and then the second curtain closes, and then you advance it and reset. So let's do bulb. I'm going to push down on the shutter button, release the shutter button, and as you can see, when I push the shutter button the first time, the first curtain opens. When I release the shutter button, the second curtain closes. So let's try this with time and see how this functions differently. Too far. I push the shutter button and the first curtain opens. Push the shutter button again and nothing happens. There are 2 ways to get out of time. You can adjust the shutter to 1/500th of a second, which closes it very quickly. Or you can advance the shutter. Advancing it, setting it to 1/500th, by the way, is the preferred method. It is easier on the camera. So after you take your timed exposure, just set it to 1/500th, and that allows all the mechanisms to complete the shutter cycle. That's what I mean by it being easier on the camera. So what would you want to use a timed exposure for? Let's say that you don't have a a long exposure cable release with a lock on it, right? I generally don't carry one with me. And you want to take a long exposure, whether it's a star trails or a waterfall shot or something, or a cloud trails if you have the proper film and lighting and everything for it. What you could do one of two things. You could set it to bulb and stand there and hold the shutter button down for however long it is, whether it's 3 seconds for a waterfall or 6 hours for a star trails. Or you could just set it to time, push the shutter down. At that point, you can either very carefully remove the lens cap. If it's a star trails, hit time, and then whenever the image is done, just come back and change the dial to 1/500th of a second. Some technique for using the time is you want to use a tripod for this. You want to have it closed down really well. And if you're doing a waterfall photo, you want to have your lens cap off first and open up your curtain. All right, if you're doing a star trails, another way to do it is, if you are very careful with this, open up the curtain and then you can take off your lens cap. And what that does is, taking the lens cap off, you have to be very careful because it's easy to introduce camera shake that way, but it will eliminate the mirror shake from the process. At night, you can also put your hand over the front of the lens instead of your lens cap, open up your curtain, and then just move your hand away. And that's just a measure to help eliminate the smallest amount of image shake that might not be noticeable, but might be. If you're doing something that's in the day or in the evening with cloud trails or waterfalls, you don't want to do the lens cap or hand trick with it. That's only something for nighttime photography with star trails. Or astro-tracked images as well, if you're doing some astro-tracking work with one of these. And that is it. That is everything we had to go over with the Pentax S or H2. A venerable camera, still very serviceable, lots of fun to use, very reliable, and because it is purely mechanical, also very simple. And you know what? It doesn't have a whole lot of bells and whistles, but with a little bit of creativity, it can still do whatever you want it to do photographically. Maybe not freeze sports because of the max shutter speed, or the fastest shutter speed, but basically anything else. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.